A white millionaire named Richard humiliates a black family at a luxury hotel, believing this will secure his future business deal. But what happens the next day is an unexpected twist that leaves him stunned. Now, Richard must face the consequences of his actions. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Richard Hastings stepped out of his sleek black luxury car, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. The warm summer breeze ruffled his salt and pepper hair as he gazed up at the impressive facade of the Grand Vista Hotel. Its gleaming windows reflected the golden rays of the setting sun, creating a dazzling display that matched Richard's soaring ambitions. With a confident smile, he strode through the revolving doors, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. The hotel's opulent interior, with its crystal chandeliers and plush furnishings, seemed to whisper promises of success and wealth, music to Richard's ears. As he approached the front desk, Richard's keen eyes darted around, taking in every detail. He was a man who believed in first impressions, and so far the Grand Vista was living up to its reputation. A young woman with a warm smile greeted him from behind the counter. "Welcome to the Grand Vista Hotel, sir. How may I assist you today?" she asked politely. Richard flashed his most charming smile. "Good evening. I have a reservation under Richard Hastings." The receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard. "Ah, yes, Mr. Hastings. We have you in one of our executive suites. Your stay with us is for 3 nights, is that correct?" "That's right," Richard nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. "I'm here on important business. In fact, I was wondering if you could tell me when the hotel's new owner might be available. I'd like to schedule a meeting as soon as possible." The young woman's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hastings, but I'm not privy to the owner's schedule. However, I can pass along your request to management if you'd like." Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He wasn't used to being denied anything, especially not information. But he quickly smoothed his features, reminding himself that this was all part of the game. "That would be wonderful, thank you. Please let them know it's of utmost importance." As the receptionist handed him his room key, Richard's mind was already formulating strategies. This partnership was crucial to expanding his empire, and he was determined to make it happen. The new owner of the Grand Vista was rumored to be a visionary in the hospitality industry, and Richard knew that aligning himself with such a force could open doors he'd only dreamed of. With a spring in his step, Richard made his way to the elevators, his anticipation growing with each passing moment. He was Richard Hastings, after all. Success was not just an option, it was an inevitability. Richard stepped into his executive suite, his eyes widening as he took in the opulent surroundings. The room was a testament to luxury, with its plush carpets, elegant furniture, and breathtaking view of the city skyline. He nodded approvingly, thinking to himself that this was exactly the kind of place where important deals were made. As he unpacked his designer luggage, Richard noticed a glossy brochure on the desk. It detailed the upcoming event where the new owner would be introduced to the hotel's most esteemed guests. He picked it up, studying it with keen interest. "Perfect," he murmured, a smile playing on his lips. This event would be the ideal opportunity to make his move. Richard walked to the large window, gazing out at the bustling city below. He could see staff members scurrying about in the hotel's beautifully manicured gardens, setting up what looked like an extravagant outdoor venue. Clearly, no expense was being spared for this introduction. Turning back to the room, he noticed every detail had been meticulously attended to. Fresh flowers adorned the coffee table, a bottle of premium champagne sat chilling in an ice bucket, and a fruit basket overflowed with exotic delicacies. Richard felt a surge of confidence. This level of preparation and luxury was familiar territory for him. He imagined the new owner, probably a distinguished gentleman much like himself, someone who appreciated the finer things in life, someone who understood the language of wealth and influence. Richard was sure they would hit it off immediately. As he settled into a plush armchair, Richard began to plan his approach. He would need to be charming, of course, but also demonstrate his business acumen. He'd drop subtle hints about his connections and the potential benefits of a partnership. "This is going to be a breeze," Richard said to himself, feeling completely in his element. He was Richard Hastings, after all. He'd sealed countless deals with people just like this new owner. This one would be no different. As evening approached, Richard made his way to the hotel's grand dining room. The opulent space was a feast for the eyes, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linens. Soft classical music played in the background, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Richard was seated at a prime table near the center of the room, where he could observe the other diners. He ordered a glass of expensive red wine and perused the menu, feeling quite satisfied with his surroundings. However, his contentment was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a family being led to a nearby table. The Parker family, a couple with one young boy, were dressed in casual attire that stood out in stark contrast to the formal wear of the other guests. Richard's brow furrowed as he watched them settle in. He couldn't help but notice their dark skin, which made them even more conspicuous in the predominantly white crowd. The young boy, though well-behaved, seemed fidgety and out of place in such a formal setting. A wave of irritation washed over Richard. He thought to himself, "How did they even get in here? This isn't some family diner." He watched as the waiter explained the menu to the Parkers, noticing their hesitation at the prices. Richard's frown deepened. In his mind, people who couldn't afford such luxury shouldn't be there at all. As he sipped his wine, Richard's thoughts turned to the upcoming event. What if the new owner saw this family? What kind of impression would that make? He worried that their presence might tarnish the hotel's image, potentially jeopardizing his chances of securing the partnership he so desperately wanted. Richard's meal arrived, but he found his appetite diminished. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Parkers' presence was somehow a personal affront to him and everything he believed the Grand Vista Hotel represented. The once perfect atmosphere now felt sullied, and Richard struggled to regain his earlier sense of confidence and excitement. Richard's irritation continued to simmer as he watched the Parker family settle into their seats at a nearby table. He couldn't help but stare, his eyes narrowing with each passing moment. The young boy swung his legs back and forth, barely able to reach the floor, while his parents spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around the room. "They must have gotten in through some charity program," Richard muttered under his breath, stabbing at his steak with more force than necessary. Or maybe it's one of those ridiculous inclusive promotions hotels are doing these days. The thought of a special offer or discount allowing people like the Parkers into such a prestigious establishment made Richard's blood boil. He had worked hard for his success, and he believed that certain places should be reserved for those who had earned their way to the top. As he continued to observe the family, Richard's mind raced with concerns about the upcoming meeting with the new owner. What if they walked in and saw this family here? Would they think the hotel was lowering its standards? Richard's chances of impressing the owner and securing that crucial partnership seemed to be slipping away with each passing minute. He imagined the conversation. "Oh, I see you're trying to appeal to a more diverse clientele," the owner might say, their nose wrinkling in distaste. Richard shuddered at the thought. This was supposed to be his moment to shine, to prove that he was the perfect business partner for a high-end establishment like the Grand Vista Hotel. Richard's food grew cold on his plate as he became consumed with worry. He barely noticed the waiter refilling his wine glass, his eyes fixed on the Parkers as they hesitantly ordered from the menu. The young boy's eyes widened as he saw the dessert cart roll by, and Richard felt a fresh wave of annoyance wash over him. "This is a disaster," he thought, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "How am I supposed to make a good impression with them here?" Richard's frustration reached a boiling point. He couldn't sit idly by and watch his chances of impressing the new owner slip away. With a deep breath, he stood up, smoothed his expensive suit, and plastered a forced smile on his face. He strode purposefully towards the Parkers' table, his shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. As he approached, the family looked up, surprise evident on their faces. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes as he addressed them. "Good evening," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. I couldn't help but notice you folks here. It's quite unusual to see such a diverse crowd in our establishment." The Parkers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond. Richard pressed on, his condescension thinly veiled. "You know, the Grand Vista Hotel has always prided itself on its exclusivity," he continued, emphasizing the word exclusivity as if it were a concept beyond their understanding. "It's a place where only the most discerning guests stay." The father of the family straightened in his chair, a frown forming on his face. "Excuse me, sir, but what exactly are you implying?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing at all. I'm just curious how you managed to secure a reservation here. Did you perhaps stumble upon some special offer or charity program?" The mother's eyes widened in shock while the young boy looked confused and slightly scared. Richard leaned in, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between us, don't you think it's important for places like this to maintain a certain standard? I mean, surely you must feel a bit out of place here." The tension at the table was palpable. The father's jaw clenched, and the mother placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. Richard stood back, his fake smile still in place, waiting for a response that would confirm his assumptions about their presence in the hotel. Richard's smile twisted into a sneer as he continued his tirade, his words becoming more blatantly discriminatory with each passing moment. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "there are plenty of other hotels in town that might be more suitable for your family. Places where you'd feel more at home, if you catch my drift." The Parkers sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of hurt and disbelief. The father's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he took a deep breath, choosing to remain calm for the sake of his family. Richard pressed on, oblivious to the pain he was causing. "I mean, surely you'd be more comfortable somewhere less fancy. Maybe a motel on the outskirts of town? That seems more your speed." The mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she held her head high, refusing to let Richard see how deeply his words cut. She gently squeezed her son's hand, silently reassuring him. Despite Richard's provocations, the Parkers chose not to engage. They knew that responding would only fuel his hateful rhetoric. Instead, they turned their attention back to their meals, pointedly ignoring Richard's presence. The father picked up his fork and knife, cutting into his steak with deliberate slowness. The mother smiled warmly at her son, asking him about his favorite part of their trip so far. The boy, taking cues from his parents, began to excitedly describe the sights they had seen earlier that day. Richard stood there, momentarily taken aback by their lack of response. He had expected them to argue, to cause a scene that would justify his prejudices. Instead, their quiet dignity in the face of his insults left him feeling oddly unsettled. As the Parkers continued their meal and conversation, effectively shutting him out, Richard found himself at a loss for words. His tirade had fallen flat, leaving him standing awkwardly by their table, his presence increasingly unwelcome and unnecessary. The Parkers finished their meal in silence, their expressions a mixture of hurt and dignity. Despite Richard's cruel words, they maintained their composure, refusing to let his prejudice ruin their evening. Mrs. Parker gently dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, while Mr. Parker placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. As they stood to leave, the family moved with grace and poise. They held their heads high, their backs straight, presenting a united front against the bigotry they had just faced. The young boy looked up at his parents, drawing strength from their quiet resolve. They made their way out of the dining room, their steps measured and unhurried. Other diners watched them go, some with sympathy in their eyes, others averting their gaze in discomfort. The Parkers' dignified exit stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of Richard's behavior. Meanwhile, Richard remained at his table, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He felt smug, convinced that he had done the hotel a great service by addressing what he perceived as a potential issue. In his mind, he had protected the establishment's reputation and ensured it maintained its exclusive atmosphere. He sipped his wine, feeling righteous in his actions. Richard truly believed that he had acted in the best interests of the hotel and its future owner. He envisioned himself as a guardian of standards, blind to the fact that his standards were built on prejudice and discrimination. As he finished his meal, Richard's thoughts turned to the upcoming meeting with the new owner. He was certain that his actions would be appreciated, perhaps even lauded. In his narrow worldview, he couldn't fathom that anyone of importance would disagree with his stance. Little did Richard know that his actions would have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. But for now, he basked in his perceived victory, oblivious to the pain he had caused and the storm that was brewing around him. Richard strode back to his luxurious suite, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. As he entered the room, he loosened his tie and sank into a plush armchair, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. He replayed the encounter with the Parker family in his mind, his lips curling into a self-satisfied smile. In his eyes, he had done what was necessary to protect his interests and those of the hotel. Richard nodded to himself, convinced that his actions were not only justified but essential. "It had to be done," he muttered, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch from the minibar. The amber liquid swirled in the crystal tumbler as he raised it to his lips. Can't have people like that ruining the atmosphere. What would the new owner think? Richard's mind wandered to the upcoming business deal. He had worked tirelessly to position himself for this opportunity, and he wasn't about to let anything jeopardize it. In his mind, the Parkers' presence was a threat to the image he wanted to project, one of exclusivity and refinement. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the twinkling city lights below. "It's all about appearances," he mused, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. "The owner will appreciate someone who understands that." As the night wore on, Richard's conviction only grew stronger. He rehearsed his pitch for the business deal, imagining how impressed the new owner would be with his vision and business acumen. In his mind, he had already secured the partnership, thanks in part to his swift action in the dining room. "Everything will go smoothly now," he reassured himself, settling into bed. "I've handled the situation. Tomorrow, I'll show them what real class looks like." With these thoughts, Richard drifted off to sleep, utterly unaware of the storm he had set in motion. His dreams were filled with visions of success and adulation, his conscience unburdened by the weight of his actions. As Richard prepared for bed, his thoughts drifted back to the upcoming event. He meticulously laid out his finest suit on the plush armchair, smoothing out any wrinkles with a satisfied smile. The crisp white shirt and silk tie were placed alongside it, a testament to his attention to detail. "Tomorrow's the big day," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. The prospect of meeting the new owner filled him with a heady mix of excitement and anticipation. Richard was confident that he had done everything necessary to ensure a successful introduction. He walked to the large mirror in the bathroom, examining his reflection critically. His eyes, sharp and calculating, stared back at him. "You've got this, Richard," he said to his reflection, his voice low and determined. "You've handled every obstacle. Nothing can stand in your way now." The events of the evening played through his mind once more. He felt a twinge of discomfort as he recounted the Parker family's hurt expressions, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. In his mind, he had done what was necessary to protect the hotel's image and, by extension, his own interests. Richard climbed into the luxurious king-sized bed, sinking into the soft, high thread count sheets. As he lay there, his mind buzzed with possibilities. He imagined the handshake that would seal the deal, the congratulatory pats on the back, the admiring glances from his peers. Success was within his grasp, and he could almost taste it. With a contented sigh, Richard reached over and turned off the bedside lamp. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains. As he settled into his pillow, a sense of calm washed over him. Everything was falling into place just as he had planned. Richard's eyes grew heavy and his breathing slowed. He drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with visions of triumph and accolades. In his slumber, a small smile played on his lips, a reflection of his unwavering confidence. Little did Richard know, his life was about to take a dramatic turn. As he slept peacefully, blissfully unaware, the wheels of fate were already in motion, set to challenge everything he thought he knew about success, status, and the true measure of a person's worth. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Richard's luxurious suite, casting a golden glow across the room. He stirred from his slumber, a smile already forming on his lips as he remembered the importance of the day ahead. Richard rose from the bed with purpose, his movements precise and deliberate. He headed to the bathroom where he meticulously groomed himself, ensuring every hair was in place and his clean-shaven face was smooth and presentable. As he dressed in his finest attire, a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and a deep blue silk tie, Richard couldn't help but admire his reflection in the full-length mirror. He looked every inch the successful businessman he prided himself on being. "Today's the day," he murmured to himself, straightening his tie with practiced ease. "Time to show them what Richard Hastings is made of." Outside his room, the hotel buzzed with activity. Staff members hurried through the corridors, making last-minute preparations for the grand event. The air was charged with anticipation and excitement. Richard stepped out of his suite, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He made his way to the elevator, nodding confidently at the hotel staff he passed. As he descended to the lobby, he mentally rehearsed his pitch one last time. The lobby was a hive of activity. Flower arrangements were being adjusted, name tags were being sorted, and a string quartet was setting up in the corner. Richard surveyed the scene with approval, feeling that such grandeur was fitting for an event of this magnitude. He approached the reception desk where a young woman greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hastings. I hope you slept well. The event will begin in the grand ballroom in about an hour. Would you like me to show you where it is?" Richard waved her off with a polite smile. "No need, my dear. I'm sure I can find my way. But tell me, has the new owner arrived yet?" Richard made his way to the grand ballroom, his steps confident and purposeful. As he entered, the sight before him took his breath away. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow across the room. Elegant floral arrangements adorned every table, their sweet scent mingling with the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The ballroom was already bustling with activity. Well-dressed men and women, clearly influential figures in their own right, mingled and chatted. The soft murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Richard's chest swelled with pride as he recognized several faces from business magazines and news reports. He was among the elite now, exactly where he believed he belonged. A waiter glided by with a tray of champagne flutes, and Richard smoothly plucked one, taking a small sip as he surveyed the room. With practiced ease, he began to make his way through the crowd. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and dropped subtle hints about his own success. All the while, his eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the new owner. As the minutes ticked by, Richard strategically positioned himself near the front of the room. He wanted to be one of the first to greet the new owner, to make that crucial first impression. He straightened his tie once more and cleared his throat, rehearsing his opening lines in his head. The anticipation in the room was palpable. Richard could feel it crackling in the air, mirroring his own excitement. He was so close now, so close to securing the deal that would catapult his business to new heights. All he needed was to meet the new owner and work his charm. As he waited, Richard's mind wandered back to the previous evening and his encounter with the Parker family. A fleeting sense of unease passed through him, but he quickly brushed it aside. He had done what was necessary, he assured himself. After all, appearances were everything in this world. The sound of a microphone being tapped brought Richard's attention sharply back to the present. His heart began to race as he realized the moment he had been waiting for was finally here. A hush fell over the room as an elderly gentleman, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, made his way to the stage. Richard recognized him instantly as Mr. Benedict Parker, the current owner of the Grand Vista Hotel. The old man's steps were slow but deliberate, his face etched with the wisdom of years. Mr. Benedict Parker reached the microphone and cleared his throat. His voice, though soft, carried a weight of authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Benedict Parker began, his eyes twinkling as he gazed out at the crowd. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. Your presence means the world to me." Richard listened intently, his posture straightening as he hung on every word. He couldn't help but admire the poise and grace with which Mr. Benedict Parker addressed the room. For over 4 decades, it has been my honor and privilege to serve as the owner of this magnificent establishment, Mr. Benedict continued, his voice filled with warmth and nostalgia. The Grand Vista Hotel has been more than just a business to me. It has been my home, and all of you, our staff and our guests, have been my family. A ripple of appreciative murmurs swept through the crowd. Richard nodded along, his mind already racing with ideas on how to impress the new owner. Mr. Benedict Parker paused for a moment, his eyes misting slightly. However, as with all things in life, there comes a time for change. It is with a heart full of gratitude and a touch of sadness that I announce my retirement. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Richard's ears perked up, his excitement building. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "But fear not," Mr. Parker said with a gentle smile, "for I leave the Grand Vista in very capable hands. Hands that I trust will not only maintain the legacy we've built, but elevate it to new heights." Richard's heart raced. He straightened his tie once more, ready to make his move as soon as the new owner was introduced. This was his chance, his moment to shine. Mr. Benedict Parker's eyes twinkled with pride as he continued. "It is my great pleasure to introduce the new owner of the Grand Vista Hotel, my son, Charles Parker." The crowd erupted in applause as a tall, distinguished man in his late 40s made his way to the stage. Richard's smile froze on his face as he watched the man approach. His heart began to race, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It was him, the father of the black family he had insulted just the night before. Charles Parker stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding and dignified. He embraced his father warmly before turning to address the audience. "Thank you, Father, and thank you all for being here today," Charles began, his voice rich and warm. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He couldn't believe what was happening. The man he had treated so disrespectfully, the man he had assumed didn't belong in this hotel, was now its owner. As Charles spoke about his vision for the hotel's future, Richard's mind reeled. He remembered every cutting remark, every condescending glance he had directed at the Parker family. The weight of his actions crashed down upon him like a ton of bricks. Richard's eyes darted around the room, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. He noticed other guests nodding approvingly at Charles's words, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Richard's mind. Charles's voice continued to fill the room, but Richard could barely hear him over the pounding of his own heart. He felt dizzy, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. The business deal he had been so eager to secure now seemed impossibly out of reach. As the realization of his grave mistake sank in, Richard felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He had let his prejudices and assumptions guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. The man he had dismissed and insulted was not only worthy of respect, but was now in a position of power over him. As the crowd's applause filled the grand ballroom, Richard stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. The sound seemed distant, muffled by the rushing of blood in his ears. His eyes were fixed on Charles Parker, the man he had so callously insulted just hours ago. Charles began to speak, his voice strong and clear, but Richard couldn't focus on the words. His mind raced, replaying every moment of his encounter with the Parker family in vivid, excruciating detail. "You might be more comfortable at a less exclusive establishment," Richard heard his own voice echo in his memory. The condescending tone, the thinly veiled insults, it all came flooding back, making his stomach churn with shame. Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room. He saw the other guests listening intently to Charles, nodding and smiling. They had no idea of the terrible mistake he had made. He felt exposed, as if at any moment Charles might point him out and reveal his true nature to everyone. The weight of his actions began to sink in, settling like a heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement was crumbling around him. The business deal he had been so eager to secure now seemed like a distant, impossible dream. A deep sense of dread washed over Richard. He realized that his prejudices and assumptions had not only cost him a potential business opportunity, but had revealed an ugly truth about himself. The man he had dismissed as unworthy was now standing before him, commanding respect and admiration from everyone in the room. Richard's breathing became shallow as panic set in. What would happen now? Would Charles expose him? Would he be publicly humiliated? Or worse, would he have to face the consequences of his actions in a more personal, private confrontation? As Charles Parker continued his speech, his words began to penetrate Richard's panicked haze. The new owner's voice was warm and sincere, filled with passion for his vision of the Grand Vista Hotel. "Our goal," Charles said, his eyes sweeping across the room, "is to create a place where everyone feels welcome and respected, regardless of their background or appearance." Richard felt each word like a sharp jab to his conscience. He remembered his own sneering remarks to the Parker family, the contempt in his voice when he suggested they didn't belong. Charles went on, "We believe that true luxury isn't just about expensive furnishings or exclusive guest lists. It's about creating an atmosphere of genuine warmth and inclusivity." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Richard. He had acted in direct opposition to everything Charles was promoting. His behavior had been the antithesis of inclusivity and respect. As Charles spoke about treating every guest with dignity, Richard's face burned with shame. He recalled the hurt in Mrs. Parker's eyes, the quiet dignity with which the family had endured his insults. Now, he understood that they had shown more class and grace than he ever had. "In this hotel," Charles declared, his voice firm and clear, "we will judge our guests not by the color of their skin or the size of their wallet, but by the content of their character." Richard's panic intensified. He felt exposed, as if everyone in the room could see right through him to the prejudiced core he had always tried to hide. His breathing became rapid and shallow as he realized the full extent of his mistake. Not only had he insulted the new owner's family, but he had also revealed himself to be everything that the Grand Vista Hotel now stood against. Richard's dream of a lucrative partnership crumbled before his eyes, replaced by the terrifying prospect of facing the consequences of his actions. As Charles Parker's speech continued, Richard found himself adrift in a sea of guilt and anxiety. The grand ballroom, once a stage for his anticipated triumph, now felt suffocating. The chandelier's sparkle seemed to mock him, their light exposing his every flaw. Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room. He searched the faces of the other guests, paranoia creeping in. Did they know? Had anyone seen his disgraceful behavior towards the Parkers? Every smile, every whisper felt like an accusation. The crowd's enthusiastic applause for Charles's vision of inclusivity rang hollow in Richard's ears. He clapped mechanically, his hands moving of their own accord while his mind raced. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Richard's gaze fell on a group of hotel staff near the back of the room. Their diverse faces beamed with pride at their new owner's words. Richard felt a pang of regret, realizing how his prejudices had blinded him to the value of diversity. As Charles spoke about treating every guest with respect, Richard's shame deepened. He recalled his condescending tone, his unfounded assumptions about the Parkers. How could he have been so blind, so cruel? The room seemed to spin around Richard. He loosened his tie, feeling as if it were choking him. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding. The grand event, which he had anticipated with such excitement, now felt like a nightmare he couldn't escape. Richard's eyes landed on Mrs. Parker, standing proudly at the side of the stage. Her dignified bearing and warm smile were a stark contrast to his own behavior. He remembered her grace in the face of his insults, and his shame intensified. As the speech drew to a close, Richard felt utterly lost. His dreams of expanding his empire lay in tatters at his feet. More than that, he was forced to confront the ugly truth about himself, a truth he had long ignored or justified. As the speech concluded, the ballroom erupted into applause. Guests began to mingle, their excited chatter filling the air. Richard, however, felt like a man drowning in a sea of his own making. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a shell of a man racked with guilt and fear. Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for Charles Parker. Every time he caught a glimpse of the new owner, his heart raced, and his palms grew clammy. He desperately tried to make himself invisible, shrinking into corners and behind potted plants. The weight of his actions from the previous night pressed down on him like a physical burden. Richard's mind raced with horrifying scenarios of Charles recognizing him and calling him out in front of everyone. The thought made his stomach churn. As he sidled along the wall, Richard overheard snippets of conversation praising Charles's vision for inclusivity. Each word felt like a dagger to his heart, reminding him of his own prejudiced behavior. He longed to disappear, to erase the events of the past day. Richard's eyes fell on the exit. The ornate double doors seemed to beckon him, offering an escape from this nightmare. He found himself inching towards them, the urge to flee growing stronger with each passing moment. But as he neared the exit, a wave of shame washed over him. Running away felt cowardly, yet facing the consequences of his actions terrified him even more. Richard stood frozen, torn between his fear and his guilt, as the party continued around him. As Richard stood paralyzed near the exit, he saw Charles Parker approaching him. His heart began to pound so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Richard's eyes darted left and right, searching for an escape route, but it was too late. Charles was already standing before him, a warm smile on his face. "Mr. Hastings, I presume?" Charles said, extending his hand. "I'm Charles Parker, the new owner of Grand Vista Hotel. Thank you so much for attending our event today." Richard's mouth went dry. He stared at Charles's outstretched hand, his own trembling as he slowly raised it to shake. The touch of Charles's firm, friendly grip sent a jolt of shame through him. I... Richard stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. Thank you for having me, Mr. Parker." Charles's kind eyes met Richard's, and for a moment, Richard wondered if he saw a flicker of recognition there. His stomach churned with dread. "I hope you've been enjoying your stay with us," Charles continued, his tone genuinely interested. "We strive to make every guest feel welcome and valued here at Grand Vista." Each word felt like a knife twisting in Richard's gut. He nodded weakly, unable to form a coherent response. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Your speech was very inspiring," Richard managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to meet Charles's gaze, instead fixing his eyes on the ornate carpet beneath their feet. Charles smiled broadly. "I'm glad you found it inspiring, Mr. Hastings. Our vision for this hotel is one of inclusivity and respect for all. We believe that diversity is our strength, and we want every guest to feel at home here, regardless of their background." Charles gestured towards a quiet corner of the ballroom, his expression calm and collected. "Mr. Hastings, would you mind joining me for a moment? I'd like to discuss something with you in private." Richard's heart sank. This was it, the moment he had been dreading since he realized his terrible mistake. He nodded stiffly, his legs feeling like lead as he followed Charles out of the bustling ballroom. They walked in silence down a plush-carpeted hallway, the sounds of the party fading behind them. Richard's mind raced, trying to think of ways to explain his behavior, to apologize, to salvage the situation somehow. But every excuse he thought of sounded hollow and insincere, even to himself. Charles led them to a small, elegantly furnished meeting room. He held the door open for Richard, who hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The click of the door closing behind them sounded final, like the closing of a trap. Richard stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hands clenched at his sides. He watched as Charles calmly walked to a pair of leather armchairs by the window and took a seat, gesturing for Richard to join him. "Please sit down, Mr. Hastings," Charles said, his voice gentle but firm. Richard lowered himself into the chair, perched on the edge as if ready to bolt at any moment. He couldn't bring himself to look Charles in the eye, instead staring at his own hands clasped tightly in his lap. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Richard could feel Charles's gaze on him, patient and unwavering. He knew he should say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Mr. Hastings, I believe we have an important matter to discuss." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear and shame. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and he had no idea how to face it. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he sat across from Charles Parker. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He knew he had to speak first, to acknowledge his terrible mistake. "Mr. Parker," Richard began, his voice shaky, I want to apologize for my behavior last night. What I said to you and your family was inexcusable. I'm truly sorry." Charles nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you for your apology, Mr. Hastings. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge your mistake." Richard blinked, surprised by Charles's calm response. He had expected anger, maybe even a demand for him to leave the hotel immediately. Instead, Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped together on his knee. "Mr. Hastings, while your actions were indeed hurtful, I believe they highlight a larger issue that needs to be addressed," Charles said, his voice steady and authoritative. "As the new owner of the Grand Vista Hotel, I want to ensure that such incidents never happen again to any of our guests." Richard listened intently, still tense but curious about where Charles was going with this. "We will be implementing new policies," Charles continued. "All hotel staff will undergo mandatory training on diversity, inclusivity, and proper guest management. These are values that the Grand Vista Hotel will prioritize moving forward." Charles's words hung in the air between them. Richard felt a mix of emotions, relief that he wasn't being immediately cast out, shame at the realization that his actions had prompted such measures, and a growing sense of respect for the man sitting across from him. "Our goal," Charles explained, "is to create an environment where every guest feels welcome and respected, regardless of their background or appearance. We want the Grand Vista to be a place that celebrates diversity and fosters understanding." Richard nodded slowly, beginning to understand the depth of Charles's vision for the hotel. It was so different from what he had imagined, yet he couldn't help but admire the thoughtfulness behind it. Richard listened intently as Charles continued to outline the new training and policies. His heart still raced, but now it was with a mix of shame and growing admiration for the man before him. "Our staff will undergo comprehensive training," Charles explained, his voice calm but firm. "We'll cover topics like cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and effective communication with diverse guests. It's not just about avoiding negative interactions, Mr. Hastings. It's about creating a truly welcoming environment for everyone who walks through our doors." Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on Charles. He couldn't help but be impressed by the thoughtfulness behind these plans. "We'll also be implementing a guest feedback system," Charles continued. "This will allow us to quickly address any concerns and continuously improve our service. Our goal is to make every guest feel valued and respected, regardless of their background." As Charles spoke, Richard felt a profound sense of regret wash over him. He had been so quick to judge, so certain of his own superiority. Now, faced with Charles's integrity and vision, Richard realized how narrow-minded he had been. "Mr. Parker," Richard said softly, I don't know what to say. Your approach to this situation is admirable. I can see now how misguided my actions were." Charles nodded, a small smile on his face. "Thank you, Mr. Hastings. I believe that everyone has the capacity to learn and grow. That's why these changes are so important. They're not just about preventing negative incidents, but about fostering understanding and respect among all our guests and staff." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The sincerity in Charles's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about good business practices or maintaining the hotel's reputation. Charles truly believed in creating a better, more inclusive world. "Your vision for the hotel it's inspiring," Richard admitted, surprised by the honesty in his own words. "I can see now that I have a lot to learn." Charles leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm, as he continued to share his vision for the Grand Vista Hotel. "We're not stopping at just training, Mr. Hastings," he said, his voice warm and passionate. "We're launching several new initiatives to promote diversity throughout our entire operation." Richard listened intently, feeling a mixture of awe and deep shame. Each word Charles spoke seemed to highlight just how misguided his own actions had been. First, Charles explained, we're implementing a diverse hiring program. We want our staff to reflect the beautiful tapestry of cultures and backgrounds that make up our community. This isn't just about meeting quotas, it's about enriching our hotel's culture and providing better service to all our guests. Richard nodded, remembering how he had assumed the Parkers couldn't possibly belong in such a luxurious establishment. The memory made him wince inwardly. Charles continued, we're also expanding our guest services to cater to a wider range of cultural needs. This includes offering multilingual concierge services, diverse menu options in our restaurants, and even partnering with local cultural organizations to offer unique experiences for our guests. As Charles spoke, Richard felt a growing sense of admiration mixed with his shame. The thoughtfulness and inclusivity of these plans were a stark contrast to his own narrow-minded behavior. Additionally, Charles said, his eyes twinkling, we're introducing a cultural exchange program for our staff. This will allow them to spend time in hotels around the world, learning about different cultures and hospitality practices. When they return, they'll bring back valuable insights and perspectives. Richard's heart sank as he realized how far removed his own behavior had been from these ideals. He had acted out of prejudice and fear, while Charles was working to create a truly inclusive environment. Mr. Parker, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, I can see now how short-sighted and harmful my actions were. Your vision for this hotel is truly remarkable. Charles nodded, a gentle smile on his face. Thank you, Mr. Hastings. I believe that by embracing diversity and inclusion, we not only create a better hotel, but also contribute to a more understanding world. Richard felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed by the contrast between Charles's noble aspirations and his own prejudiced behavior. He realized he had a long way to go to align himself with these ideals, but for the first time he felt a genuine desire to try. Charles took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he looked at Richard. Mr. Hastings, he began, his voice gentle but firm. I believe in second chances. I believe that people can change, especially when they're exposed to a balanced environment where diversity and respect are valued. Richard's eyes widened, surprised by the unexpected turn in the conversation. He had been bracing himself for anger or punishment, not this offer of redemption. You see, Charles continued, our goal here isn't just to change policies. It's to change hearts and minds, and that includes giving people the opportunity to grow and learn from their mistakes. Richard felt a lump forming in his throat, touched by Charles's compassion. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Charles leaned forward, his eyes bright with sincerity. Mr. Hastings, I'd like to invite you to contribute to our new initiatives. Your business expertise could be invaluable in promoting the hotel's new direction. Richard blinked in disbelief. You want my help? After what I did? Charles nodded. Yes, I do. I believe your experience, combined with a newfound understanding of inclusivity, could make a significant impact. This is your chance to make amends, to be part of something truly transformative. Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He was being offered not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to right his wrongs. With tears in his eyes, he nodded. Mr. Parker, I'm deeply sorry for my actions, and I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity. I accept your offer. I want to help, to learn, to do better. Charles smiled warmly, extending his hand. Then welcome aboard, Mr. Hastings. Together, we can make the Grand Vista Hotel a beacon of inclusivity and respect. As Richard shook Charles's hand, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he had a long journey ahead, but for the first time, he felt hopeful about the future. Richard threw himself into the hotel's new initiatives with a fervor that surprised even him. He spent long hours in meetings with Charles and the hotel staff, learning about cultural sensitivity and the importance of diversity in the hospitality industry. As the days passed, Richard found himself growing more and more passionate about the changes. He offered his extensive business contacts to help spread the word about the Grand Vista Hotel's new direction. His resources proved invaluable in organizing diversity workshops and cultural awareness seminars for the staff. One afternoon, Richard sat in on a training session led by a diversity expert. As he listened to stories of guests who had faced discrimination in other hotels, he felt a pang of guilt, remembering his own behavior. But instead of letting the shame overwhelm him, he used it as motivation to work harder. "I never realized how much impact a simple gesture of respect could have," Richard said to Charles after the session. "It's opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about hospitality." Charles nodded, a small smile on his face. "That's exactly what we're aiming for, Richard. It's not just about policies, it's about changing hearts and minds." Richard found himself eagerly learning about different cultures and customs. He suggested creating welcome packages for international guests, featuring information about local attractions that might appeal to their specific interests. The idea was met with enthusiasm from the staff. As weeks turned into months, Richard noticed a change in himself. He no longer judged people based on their appearance or assumed background. Instead, he found himself genuinely interested in the stories of the diverse array of guests who stayed at the Grand Vista. One day, as Richard was helping to organize a multicultural food festival in the hotel's grand ballroom, he overheard two guests talking excitedly about how welcoming the hotel felt. His heart swelled with pride, knowing he had played a part in creating that atmosphere. "You know," Richard said to Charles later that day, "I never thought I'd say this, but working on these initiatives has been the most rewarding experience of my career. It's not just about business anymore. It's about making a real difference in people's lives." As Richard became more deeply involved in the hotel's new initiatives, a profound change began to take root within him. The more he learned about diversity and inclusion, the more he realized how misguided his past behavior had been. His interactions with the hotel staff and guests from all walks of life opened his eyes to the richness of human experiences he had previously overlooked. One quiet evening, as Richard sat alone in his hotel suite, he found himself reflecting on the night he had confronted the Parker family. The memory, once a source of smug satisfaction, now filled him with shame and regret. He closed his eyes, recalling the hurt expressions on their faces, and felt a wave of remorse wash over him. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered to himself, shaking his head. The next day, as Richard helped organize a cultural awareness workshop for the hotel staff, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of guilt. He watched as people from different backgrounds shared their experiences, and he felt a growing desire to make amends for his past actions. During a break in the workshop, Richard approached Charles Parker, his heart pounding with nervous energy. "Charles," he began hesitantly, I need to apologize. My behavior towards your family that night was inexcusable. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I want to express how grateful I am on second chance you've given me." Charles listened patiently as Richard poured out his heartfelt apology. The sincerity in Richard's voice was unmistakable, and Charles could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Thank you for your apology, Richard," Charles replied softly. "I can see that you've truly changed." Richard nodded, feeling a mix of relief and determination. "I want to do more," he said. "I want to make things right, not just with your family, but with everyone I've ever misjudged or treated unfairly because of my prejudices." As the days passed, Richard threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He volunteered for every initiative, no matter how small, eager to contribute to the hotel's inclusive atmosphere. He made a point of engaging with guests from all backgrounds, listening to their stories with genuine interest and respect. Charles Parker approached Richard one afternoon, a warm smile on his face. "Richard, I'd like to invite you to join my family for a private lunch tomorrow. Would you be interested?" Richard felt a mixture of surprise and nervousness. His heart raced as he replied, I'd be honored, Charles. Thank you." The next day, Richard stood outside the hotel's private dining room, taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. He smoothed his shirt and knocked gently on the door. Charles opened it, greeting Richard with a welcoming handshake. "Come in, Richard. We're glad you could join us." As Richard stepped into the room, he saw Mrs. Parker and their children seated at a beautifully set table. The aroma of delicious food filled the air, but Richard barely noticed it. His attention was focused on the family he had once treated so poorly. Mrs. Parker stood up and extended her hand. "Welcome, Mr. Hastings. Please have a seat." Richard was struck by the genuine warmth in her voice. He had expected coldness or resentment, but there was none. As he sat down, the youngest Parker child offered him a shy smile. "We're having my favorite today," the little boy said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mama's special chicken pot pie." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The kindness of this family, despite his past behavior, was overwhelming. He looked around the table, seeing nothing but open and friendly faces. As they began to eat, Charles engaged Richard in conversation about the hotel's new initiatives. The entire family listened intently, offering their own ideas and insights. Richard was amazed at how easily they included him in their discussion, treating him like a welcome guest rather than someone who had wronged them. Throughout the meal, Richard observed the loving interactions between the Parker family members. Their laughter was infectious, their conversations filled with respect and genuine interest in each other's thoughts. It was a stark contrast to the cold, businesslike dinners Richard was accustomed to. As the lunch progressed, Richard found himself relaxing. The nervous knot in his stomach began to unwind, replaced by a warm feeling of acceptance. He realized that this family's ability to forgive and welcome him was a powerful lesson in itself. As the main course was served, Richard felt a weight pressing on his chest. He knew he couldn't continue without addressing the elephant in the room. Taking a deep breath, he set down his fork and looked at each member of the Parker family. I need to say something," Richard began, his voice trembling slightly. "What I did that night in the dining room was inexcusable. I treated you all horribly, and I'm deeply ashamed of my actions." The Parkers fell silent, their eyes fixed on Richard as he continued. "I want to offer you my sincerest apology," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. My behavior was cruel and discriminatory, and I regret it more than I can express. I hope you can forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Mrs. Parker reached out and gently patted Richard's hand. "Mr. Hastings, thank you for your apology. We appreciate your honesty and courage in addressing this." Charles nodded in agreement. "We all make mistakes, Richard. What matters is how we learn and grow from them. We can see the effort you've been making, and we accept your apology." Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. The kindness and grace of the Parker family touched him deeply. The youngest Parker child piped up, "Does this mean Mr. Hastings is our friend now?" The question brought a chuckle from everyone at the table, breaking the tension. Charles smiled at his son and said, "Yes, I believe it does." As the meal continued, the atmosphere lightened considerably. The Parkers began sharing stories about their family vacations, filling the room with laughter. Richard found himself drawn into their warm circle, sharing some of his own humorous travel mishaps. Mrs. Parker regaled them with the tale of Charles getting lost during their honeymoon in Paris, ending up at the wrong hotel. Charles playfully defended himself, causing everyone to burst into laughter. As Richard listened and laughed along, he felt the barriers that had once divided them crumbling away. He realized that he was experiencing something he had been missing in his life: genuine human connection, free from judgment or pretense. Inspired by the warmth and sincerity of the Parker family, Richard felt a strong desire to do more. He cleared his throat and looked at Charles with newfound respect. "Charles, I'm truly moved by your vision for the hotel," Richard said earnestly. "I'd like to contribute further if I can. How else might I help more?" Charles smiled, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "I'm glad you asked, Richard. There are several ways you could make a significant impact. Additionally, we're looking to support community outreach programs that align with our values," Charles said. "Your connections and resources could help us make a real difference in people's lives." Mrs. Parker chimed in. "We're particularly interested in programs that provide job training and opportunities for underprivileged youth in the hospitality industry." Richard's mind began to race with possibilities. He thought of the numerous contacts he had made over the years, people who could help bring these ideas to life. "I think I know just the right people to help with that," Richard said, his excitement growing. "I have connections with several vocational schools and community colleges. We could set up internship programs, maybe even scholarships." Charles beamed at Richard's enthusiasm. "That's exactly the kind of initiative we're looking for, Richard. Your expertise and network could open doors for so many young people." As they continued to discuss ideas, Richard felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He realized that his wealth and influence could be used for something far more meaningful than just expanding his own empire. "I'd also like to host a series of workshops," Richard suggested, bringing in diverse speakers to share their experiences in the hospitality industry. It could help change perspectives and promote understanding among staff and guests alike. The Parkers nodded approvingly, and Charles reached out to shake Richard's hand. "Richard, your commitment to this cause is truly admirable. Together we can make the Grand Vista Hotel a beacon of inclusivity and opportunity." Richard eagerly nodded, his eyes shining with newfound purpose. "I'd be honored to help, Charles. You can count on me." In the weeks that followed, Richard threw himself into supporting the Grand Vista Hotel's new initiatives. He reached out to his extensive network, connecting Charles with influential figures who could help promote the hotel's commitment to diversity and inclusivity. One sunny afternoon, Richard found himself in a meeting room, surrounded by a diverse group of community leaders. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," Richard said, his voice filled with sincerity. "The Grand Vista Hotel is embarking on a journey to become a true beacon of inclusivity in our community. We need your help to make this vision a reality." As Richard outlined the hotel's plans, he felt a warmth in his chest. This was so different from his usual business dealings, focused solely on profit. Here, he was working towards something greater, something that could change lives. Richard's days became a whirlwind of activity. He spent hours on the phone, arranging meetings and organizing events. He worked closely with local schools to set up internship programs for underprivileged youth, giving them a chance to learn about the hospitality industry firsthand. One day, as Richard walked through the hotel lobby, he overheard a young intern excitedly telling her friend about her experience. "I never thought I'd have a chance to work in a place like this," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "But Mr. Hastings and Mr. Parker gave me this opportunity. It's changed my whole future." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He quickly turned away, blinking back tears. This was the impact he had always wanted to make, even if he hadn't realized it before. As the weeks turned into months, Richard saw the hotel transform. The staff was more diverse, the atmosphere more welcoming. Guests from all walks of life filled the lobby, creating a vibrant, inclusive environment. Richard's own transformation was just as profound. He found himself looking at the world through new eyes, seeing potential and value in people he might have overlooked before. His heart swelled with pride every time he saw the positive changes taking place at the Grand Vista Hotel. The grand ballroom of the Grand Vista Hotel sparkled with elegance as guests from all walks of life mingled and chatted. The air buzzed with excitement and warmth. Richard stood near the entrance, greeting people with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He watched as a group of young interns dressed in smart uniforms confidently guided guests to their tables. His chest swelled with pride, remembering how nervous they had been on their first day. Now they moved with purpose and grace. Charles Parker approached, his wife and son by his side. "Richard," he said, clapping him on the shoulder, "this is truly a sight to behold. Look at how far we've come." Richard nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "It's more beautiful than I ever could have imagined, Charles. Thank you for giving me the chance to be a part of this." As the evening progressed, Richard found himself constantly amazed by the diversity of the guests and the harmony that filled the room. People from different backgrounds shared tables, laughing and enjoying each other's company. The hotel staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, their faces reflecting the joy around them. Later, as the music softened and the night drew to a close, Richard found himself standing with the Parker family. He looked at each of them, Charles, his wife, and his son, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and affection. "I can't thank you enough," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what true hospitality and inclusivity look like. You've changed me for the better." Mrs. Parker smiled warmly. "Richard, you've become a part of our family. We're so proud of the work you've done and the person you've become." Overwhelmed by their kindness, Richard opened his arms. The Parkers moved in, enveloping him in a group hug. As they embraced, Richard felt the last of his old prejudices melt away, replaced by a deep, abiding love for this family and the values they represented. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the Parkers and the success of the evening, Richard knew that this was just the beginning of a beautiful journey towards a more inclusive and respectful world. If you enjoyed the story of Richard and the Parker family, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.